Welcome to Cyversity Engage webinar. Today's topic is on a step towards continuous trust with continuous audit metrics. The event today is sponsored by Cloud Security Alliance, so we're very appreciative of that. Our Engage program is designed to grow, develop, and highlight career opportunities, diverse talent, and contributions within the cybersecurity space. Some of the topic areas covered are career development, career spotlight, transitions, leadership, as well as technology talks. We also include in our Engage program diversity highlights, some you'll see listed here. For today's agenda, I will start out introducing you to our guest speakers, turn it over to them to do the presentation today. After the presentation time, we'll have time for Q&A for you to engage with our speakers. So please make sure to post your questions in the QA section to address during that time. Following that, you'll be provided with some of the benefits and information on Cyversity membership, upcoming Engage webinars. I'd also like to invite you to communicate with us on the Atlanta chapter on the Slack channel. As well, you can email us at atlanta@cyversity.org. One other item, today's Engage is being recorded, and then also you'll be provided with the survey towards the end of today's webinar. We ask that you complete that to provide feedback on today's topic. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you and turn things over to Mosi Platt. Thank you, Mosi and Raj, for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cassandra.
And I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can show yours now, okay?
All right, here we go. All right, so Raj and I are here today to talk about something that we talk about a lot amongst ourselves and on the Cloud Security Alliance's Continuous Audit Metrics group, and that's about continuous trust. So first, a little background. We volunteer with the Continuous Audit Metrics Working Group. And when it comes to building trust amongst cloud service providers and cloud service customers, the CSA provides some important tools that help in that process. The first is the Cloud Controls Matrix. It's a cybersecurity control framework for cloud computing that provides 197 controls across 17 security domains in its latest version that cover guidance for cloud service providers and customers both, depending on where you fall in the shared responsibility model. And then the second key tool is the Security, Trust, Assurance, and Risk Registry, which is this publicly accessible registry online that documents the security and privacy controls that are provided by participating cloud services. And it covers a range of organizations from AWS to Zoom. So if you want to know how or what kind of security a cloud provider has implemented, you can find that in the registry, and it's tied to the CSA Cloud Controls Matrix. We were just talking before the call, Raj and I have been working with the Continuous Audit Metrics Working Group for about 2 years now. Raj, I don't know how you feel, but for me personally, they're the best conversations I have each week.
No, absolutely the same here, same here. Mostly just so that, you know, at least what I see is only part, the entire slide is not visible. I see your notes as well.
All right, let's fix that.
Looks good.
Here we go. How's that?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, Raj, when we talk about continuous trust, why don't you tell us about how it breaks down in terms of the traditional lines of defense.
Will do. I see the notes slide again, Mosi. It overlays on. Yeah, I think now it is better. So I guess so number one, thank you all for having us in the conversation, and it is a very important conversation. And any sustainable system, right, will have to have checks and balances. And what typically IAA calls as the 3 lines of defense is something that we are all very familiar with. And what we are trying to bring through this conversation, Mosi and I, are 2 perspectives into this, right? So if you take the 3 lines of defense, in fact, there are broadly the doers and the checkers. But if you sort of break them down in terms of the control owners, people who are responsible for these controls that are risk-based, that are threat model-based, you can sort of break them down into what we typically see in the IT segments, right? From application engineering to platform engineering to security engineering. My experience in the last 27 years particularly spans this area, right? I've been a software developer. I've been a product engineer for almost all my life. So I'm sort of, that is the perspective I bring into this entire conversation, the perspective of an engineer. And that's what we typically call as the first line of defense, right? And I've spanned across all these different sort of areas. And Mosi, I want you to sort of talk about your experience in terms of what your experience has been in these areas of GRC assurance and audit.
Yes, and so in my career, I've kind of crossed all 3 lines in terms of IT operations, security operations early in my career, and then shifted into the security GRC, the second line of defense, where security GRC and assurance teams help the first line provide evidence of compliance and assurance to the third line of defense. And then the third line of defense shares that with the board, management, and stakeholders. So I've done a little bit across all 3. I've never been an external auditor, but I have done internal audit work. And the perspective changes. It helps to have visibility across all 3 because you know what the challenges the first line faces in providing evidence of compliance and assurance to the second and third lines, but you also know the expectations that the third line has when it needs to provide evidence of compliance or report on compliance and assurance to its stakeholders. So Raj, now that we've kind of laid out the 3 lines and you're actually across the 3, where are we at current day?
So there are seismic shifts that are happening, right? And particularly I don't think we don't even start any conversation without the word cloud, and we don't definitely start any conversation without the word DevOps. So the frequency at which software is getting released, right? The applications are being released has exponentially increased. So we are in a very interesting, but if you sort of break this down into the 3 lines of defense, I think there is a broader question if we are all moving in a sort of at the same pace, right? And in reality, it is also a very difficult thing to do in some of these areas, right? And there are many challenges, and I'm sure Mosi will talk about some of that. But if you really look at why it is very critical, right, for us to be able to look at continuous security assurance, continuous audit metrics, it is because what we would put as the sort of the confluence of these 4 waves, right, if you will. And there could be other things, but essentially sort of we would, if you have to categorize them against these 4 buckets. One is what we would call as the technology wave, right? Essentially, I think applications, the way that the applications are getting packaged and the applications are getting deployed is fundamentally changing, right? You have the Kubernetes and you have the service meshes of the world, especially in very strong cloud formats, right? Things like AKS, GKE, EKS, right? The Kubernetes versions of these applications that are merging along with these cloud services is significantly shaping the way that the applications are getting released, right? The frequency at which these applications are getting released is getting huge. Now, if you take the second thing, that is what we are also seeing is, for example, not only are the applications getting released, right, architected being differently, they're also looking at the security posture of these applications are also drastically changing, right? The way that we think of security, from the traditional way of looking at security from a perimeter perspective to what we call as the zero trust, right? The ability for us to be able to trust or not trust any applications or any services, right? And to be able to be able to ask them to earn the trust is becoming mainstream as well, right? And there are the federal executive orders that were published last year, and that sort of comes into effect. But I would actually use a different term. In fact, I would prefer to use a term called open trust. I think that's a whole different discussion that we need to have another day. But the idea is that the way that these applications are architected and deployed, and the way that we have to come together as a community, internally, even within our organization, right? From the engineering teams to the security teams, are also drastically changing. The third is what we would ask, sort of I would say that sort of the consequence of that is the compliance wave, right? And maybe the compliance wave is too narrow a word. The idea is that the frameworks are also maturing, right? If you look at the work that is being done in CSA, right? And I think that is a very clear attestation to the acknowledgement of what is happening in the industry as a whole. Even if you look at the recent sort of pronouncements on PCI DSS 4.0, there is a very clear movement of trying to look at this from a programmatic perspective, right? And trying to move and operate governance, compliance, and risk at the speed of DevOps, right? And that is something that you are very clearly seeing. And the changes that is happening around OSCAL, all of these are very assuring, but that is definitely a wave that is pushing, because most of security teams understand they have an obligation to work on some of these compliance and risk aspects, and these frameworks are also moving in that direction. And the last I would call is what we would call as sort of the collaboration wave. In fact, Mosi had been proposing, sort of has been a big proponent of this for a long time, which is that the way that the applications are consumed, right, and the services are consumed is also drastically changing within the organization, right? No longer are we talking about these big monolithic applications, or in fact, web applications. We want to meet the users where he or she or they are, right, in terms of whether it is Slack or Teams, and that is also changing. All in all, I think what we are basically saying is that the traditional notion of how we are doing audits, right, and the traditional tools that have served us well for so long, I think the question is that do they continue to serve us well, right, as we move beyond? And I think we will have to relook at how we are evaluating these security postures, these metrics, right, and how we conduct for audit these applications and services will have to also continuously change. And I think that's sort of the main thesis of why we at the CSA, right, when we look at us and the work that we are doing around the continuous audit metrics, this is the thing that really shaped us, right, in terms of how we look at how do we transform from this traditional notion of sort of a periodic way of looking at services to audit to somewhat more continuous way of auditing them and collecting metrics. Mosi, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant way to lay out the problem, right? Because you have the technology wave, which you said made the evolution from monolithic applications to now microservices and even serverless functions. So it's gotten broken down into many smaller components. So there's been spread there. But so you have more technology, but at the same time, you've got the zero trust wave. So you have more technology that is less trusted and a higher level of assurance it needs to provide across each individual component, right? And that's coming from the President of the United States in an executive order. And then you have this compliance wave where these regimes these frameworks are recognizing that, hey, if we have to provide more assurance across a high level of assurance across more technology, our current frameworks don't really work for that model, right? So like you said, PCI DSS version 4, they have a whole new way to give the assurance provider, give the organization that has to be in compliance with, okay, well, if you don't meet the specific requirements with the PCI DSS, here's a process you can use to show how you analyze the risk and determine that you can manage it in your own way while still addressing the intent of the standard instead of going by the exact letter of the standard. So they had to become more flexible. You got the open security controls assessment language from NIST, like you mentioned, OSCAL, right, being developed so that organizations can be more flexible in how they document their compliance instead of using, the spreadsheets like you had on the slide. Right now, you can do it in markup languages. And then when we talk about you talk about DevOps and moving at the speed of business. Well, the speed of business now has migrated from the rate of email, where you hopefully get to zero inbox by the end of the day, to collaboration tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams, where you are literally messaging in real time, right? The latency has shrunk. So I think that's a great way to illustrate the problem of what we're trying to do, and why we need to get more continuous ourselves in terms of our audit metrics. And that gets to the problem of cloud security assurance simply being too slow. And so we talked about some of the existing compliance frameworks like PCI or SOC 2 or an ISO 27001 certification. And these are annual updates, right? I think the most frequent SOC 2 attestation I've seen provided is Microsoft does quarterly, right? But that's about as fast as you can go. And the problem with that is it's too slow when compared to how the business is moving, especially with a company as large as Microsoft or any of the other major cloud providers. The frequency of changes to the code base that the SOC 2 is providing, some assurance for is much faster than quarterly, right? Like cloud native companies make changes on a daily basis, if not, hourly basis. And so anything less than that, by the time you get, I'll tell a story. When I was working at my first cloud native company, and we're preparing for the SOC 2, and I'm getting evidence on, how many changes are released to production a day. I'm talking to the VP of engineering, and I get the data from the change management system, and it looks like on an average, there's 10 to 15 changes being released to production each day. And the VP of engineering says the goal is to get to 100 changes released to production each day. But we only do the SOC 2 once a year, and I could only audit the changes quarterly because it was just small staff. It was just 2 of us. But at 10 changes a day, 5 days a week, that's 50 changes a week. That's 200 changes a month. That's 600 changes each quarter. And I'm only going to look at best 10%. So now we're only going to look at 60 changes out of 600. And then by the time we get to the SOC 2, it takes 1 month for the SOC 2 auditors to finalize the audit report after collecting the evidence. So they get evidence at one state, and then 200 changes later, a report is published. Well, the report is for a system that doesn't really exist anymore. It's 200 changes ago. And so the speed of assurance is just simply too slow compared to the speed of business. And you take that same problem that you have with your frequency of changes in your code base, and then you have your supply chain, right? So the open source software that you use, that changes at its own rate. The commercial software you use changes at its own rate. And then there are vulnerabilities in that code, in your code, and the code in your supply chain. There was probably a good example to show what it's like at a large company is, I think, in the AWS podcast, I think it's episode 506. This is from last year. They stated that AWS released over 2,700 features across 200 plus services in 2021. So can you imagine trying to provide assurance for the security of that many changes? And then you have vulnerability research firms like Google's Project Zero and the Zero Day Initiative talking about that not only are more vulnerabilities being announced, like I think Zero Day Initiative said they have already purchased 1,700 vulnerabilities this year to date. But the patches to fix those vulnerabilities, the quality is declining. So Google reported on its Project Zero blog, as of June 15th, there were 18 zero days that they detected and disclosed as being exploited in organizations. And half of those 18 were not really 0 days. They were just variations of previously patched vulnerabilities. So the previous patches were ineffective and the vulnerabilities could be exploited still. And so that's leading to increased frequency of breaches because the patches for the vulnerabilities are no good while the vulnerabilities are increasing. all of this is just happening at a time where assurance needs to be much faster than just once a year or quarterly. And Raj, that takes us into our first question for the audience. So we would love to know from the people that are attending this, how often does your organization need to receive assurance from its internal and external security providers? Raj, what do you think? What do you expect the answers to be?
I don't know what the answer is going to turn out, because I think every organization is different. But the answer, again, I think the tone we have set is that it has to happen at the speed of DevOps, right? For anything to be anything to provide that level of assurance. So it'll be, but there are practical limitations that organizations face, and I think this is where the theory and the practice deviate, right? And I'll be interested to see what the response is going to be.
And so we would love to see some feedback in the chat or in the Q&A. All right, so this is the Cloud Security Alliance's solution to the problems that Raj and I outlaid, and it's this idea of continuous assurance. And so the security, trust assurance, and risk registries that I mentioned earlier has different levels of assurance that it can provide. So level 1 is a self-assessment. And now there's this idea that the CSA is working on, this star level 1 continuous, where instead of assessing your own organization against the cloud controls matrix once a year, you can do it on a recurring basis, such as monthly. So monthly, you update how well you're doing with your implementation of the cloud controls matrix guidance. The level 2 is, instead of doing a self-assessment, a third party comes in. So similar to a SOC 2 or an ISO certification. And in fact, the CSA leverages those existing certification or attestation processes for level 2. But the star level 2 continuous would be, instead of having that third party conduct their audit once a year, there is a process that it can be done on a monthly basis. And then level 3, I'm sorry, it's not a monthly basis. It's the annual audit plus your own monthly self-assessment. So an independent auditor comes in and says, this is how well company A is doing against the cloud controls matrix. And then company A provides its own monthly updates on how that changes, whether it improves, declines, gets corrected, and improves again. You can report that yourself so that your stakeholders have an idea of, we know the company A started here, and then 200 plus changes later in their environment, this is where they are, right? And then continuous auditing at star level 3 is where an independent auditor comes in, and using something like continuous audit metrics can, on a monthly basis, update their audit findings with how well company A is doing against the cloud controls matrix. And so the continuous audit metrics we're developing can be used for level 3, but we also hope that organizations use them for their own self-assessments at level 2 on a continuous basis. So that's kind of what we're trying to develop and work towards, so that as you higher your levels go, there's more transparency and there's more assurance provided.
I'm Mosi.
Yes.
Just to let you know, there is a couple of responses in the Q&A.
Okay.
Would you like me to read that out to you all?
Fire away.
Okay, so one response says SOC 2 requirements from an assertion should be no less than 6 months. Internally, there should be ongoing review / assessment, meaning continuous assessment / feedback.
That is true. But the problem is, you can only provide assurance that you're doing that when the auditor comes in to verify it, right? There's no mechanism for the SOC 2 to provide that to the SOC 2 report readers before the next audit report is issued. And so you can have that internal continuous process, but providing assurance that you do that continuously there's no continuous mechanism to do that part. And that's where it kind of starts to break down a little bit. Or I shouldn't say break down, that's where it needs to evolve, so that internal requirement becomes something you can provide to your external stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. The other 2 questions we can address later. They're not related to what you and Raj just asked. So.
Okay. So Raj, if we see continuous audit metrics as a way to start providing continuous assurance, what does that look like at the first line of defense?
So in fact, there is a question from Nalini I see on the chat as well that is somewhat related to this, but we will certainly get to it. But the way we looked at it, and I think Mosi talked about this, if you go to the CSA CCM V4, there are these 17 domains, right? What you see on the right, the control domains. If you look at this from a threat perspective, right, I mean, one easy sort of reference point would be, for example, if you go to Kubernetes, what they call as a C4 model. They have these 4 lines of Cs, right, from a threat perspective that starts from code, containers, cluster, and cloud, right? So essentially, you can you have, and if you expand that model, is what you're seeing on this sort of left-hand side, right? So you have to go all the way from the components, the supply chain issues that Mosi talked about, all the way to the users, right, and the devices that they use. And we are all familiar with some parts of the model. The issue is not that. And I think the question is, the way we started out this from a continuous audit metrics is that we said, okay, if we wanted to be able to address realistically, and it is clearly a work in progress, right? We came up with 31 metrics so far, and we are continuing to expand on that. And I think we need all your help to be part of the working group and sort of provide us some feedback on those things as well. But what we basically did was to look at this from the perspective of each of those control domains and identify the critical metrics, right, or the controls for which we can create some of those important metrics that can address the problems of the day, right? For example, what we saw with SolariGate, Log4j, right? By no means are we saying that you are able to sort of develop these metrics and we will be able to prevent some of these problems. That's not the point here. The point is that how do we collectively come together as a security assurance community in order to be able to provide these metrics and articulate these metrics that we can collect on a continuous basis. So the point here is that how do we talked about what the speed at which the DevOps is moving. Mosi clearly beautifully articulated in terms of what this means on the challenges that exist. And what we are trying to do on the working group in the continuous audit metrics is to say, how do we identify some of these metrics? What is the structure that we put in place? And does it add value for us to be able to continuously measure this and report this? And I think we'll continue to expand as we go. But right now there are around 31 metrics, and you see sort of the breakdown. And I would also actually point out to you, there is a fantastic document, and maybe we'll point out to the GitHub site, right? If you go to the GitHub site for the Cloud Security Alliance, and I'll put the link there, there is also a presentation that was made by Max Fredkin, who's the co-chair of the working group, and he has done a phenomenally great job of articulating what the types of controls we have and how did we go about sort of developing some of these controls, right, and reporting some of these metrics. So I would also strongly point you to go into look at that report. But this is the approach that we have taken, right? And how do we sort of identify and categorize these metrics? And our goal is to be able to use them from the perspective of programmatic aspects so that we are able to continuously report on these metrics. And I think we should continue to expand on these metrics as well, Mosi.
Agreed. And Max's presentation was a great breakdown of what it looks like at the first line of defense, and even maturing a program from the beginning to where you start and where you want to go. Okay, so here's 2 examples of some of the continuous audit metrics that we published in version 1 of the Continuous Audit Metrics Catalog from the CSA. So vulnerability management, the percentage of high and critical vulnerabilities that are triage and compliant with your organization's policy. So if your organization says that, for example, like PCI DSS, the previous version required high and critical vulnerabilities be addressed within 30 days, right? What percentage of your high and critical vulnerabilities were triage in compliance with that policy or that requirement? And so the vulnerability remediation schedule. So I guess we should distinguish between triage and remediation. So triage is a vulnerability scanner identifies a high and critical vulnerability based off of its CVSS score or its own internal scoring mechanism. But how many of those are actually high and critical in your environment? For example, like Raj mentioned, Log4j. Are you actually using Log4j in your systems, right? Even if you're using a version, but is Log4j implemented? So it may not be relevant in your environment. And then once you determine the high and critical vulnerabilities that are relevant to your environment, how many of them are you remediating within the time required by your policy? So that's kind of what these two metrics are getting at. And actually working on a proof of concept with Raj right now, implementing both of these metrics at Netflix. We hope to have that wrapped up in the next by the end of September. So we'll keep you posted on how that's going. But so far, so good. Like so far, we have visibility into these percentages, and it's interesting when you see the number across your entire environment as opposed to just seeing an array of individual vulnerabilities. So another question for the audience is, what percentage of your security program is covered by metrics? Raj, we've been in the working group for 2 years, and we talk to people in our network. What percentage do you typically see across the industry, or do you expect to see from this audience?
No, to be very honest, I think what I see in the industry is that it is a very, very low percentage. The challenge is that I think there is also the lack of maturity of the tools that exist, right, in order to be able to do this. And I think we are getting better and better. So the good news is that we are getting better. But the reality is that in my experience, I see so I don't want to bias. I don't want to throw out a number. I would be interested to see what those numbers are if somebody wants to. But I can certainly share at the end of it what I see typically, but it is definitely very much slower than what we should expect, right? If you think that, for example, 60-70% is a reasonable number, what we typically see implemented. I'm not talking about the intent here. I think we all understand, nobody argues against automation. So that's not the point here. The question is how much have we really implemented, right? And how much are we really truly measuring this on a continuous basis? It's a very, very low number.
And I think there's two parts to it, right? There's what percentage of the program is covered by metrics and what percentage is covered by automated metrics.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can measure something manually in your security program, and you're typically covering it by metrics. Because I know when we met with ISAC and Silicon Valley chapter, there was the percentage of coverage was higher than I expected, but we didn't delve into how much of that was manual versus automated. And I know NIST published a special publication, probably a decade ago, looking at what percentage of NIST 853 could be automated. And I think it was around 20 to 25%. They said could be those controls were easily automatable. But that was 10 years ago. We'll see where people are nowadays.
I think the two things that I can think of on top of my, that comes to my mind right now, Mosi, is that one, for example, Ross Young, I believe he is the CISO of Caterpillar, right? He actually published what is called a CISO dashboard, and it is a collection of some of the other work that he had done as well. I think it is in the public domain. And very similarly, there was another sort of set of guidance that was provided by Neil Daswani. He was the CISO at Stanford, if I remember right. But he's an author of he has been an author of several books and veteran in the sort of cybersecurity space. And if you really look at most of the metrics, they come around some very standard sort of areas, right? I mean, they look at vulnerability, they look at phishing, right? And I think those are very clearly important areas, don't get me wrong. But I think if you really look at a broader set of metrics in order for us to be able to measure, and I think the CSA CCM 17 domains capture that really well, right? And you can use sort of other frameworks as well. But so I think there is a need for us to be able to move beyond the specific set of metrics that we currently put together on a reporting dashboard to go beyond it into a holistic framework. And that is what I mean by saying that I actually would expect to see a lot more, and I'm sure it will happen, but you don't see that very much in practice today.
It's a good call out. All right, so Raj, given that, what are some of the technical challenges with implementing continuous audit metrics?
I think security assurance teams, security compliance teams have lots of challenges. So I think it is maybe it is not fair for us to say that here are these 4 challenges, right? And that's not the idea here. And I'm sure all of you have sort of many different challenges that you face, right? Both in terms of the whether it is the financial or the administrative side of the challenges, or to the technical challenges. From the technical perspective, I would say that if I were to categorize them, I'll put them into 4 buckets, right? Number 1 is that I think there is security assurance. This idea of, as you move towards sort of continuous security assurance, and that if you want to operate at the speed of DevOps, it is clearly a team sport, right? And we need to be able to involve other stakeholders in the organization, other stakeholders in the community as well. And I think one of the challenges that I have consistently seen is that I think the current tools, right, create a friction in that model, right? And I think we need to be able to move past this, where we are able to bring in these different stakeholders into this conversation. Slack and Teams, Mosi, that you are talking about, are fantastic opportunities for us to be able to do so. But no matter how you do it, the goal should be to be able to bring in more people into this conversation, right? Even within the organization. So I think, how do we sort of reimagine this idea of security GRC from a collaboration perspective needs to happen, right? And I would say, from that perspective, I think GRC should be, in fact, it is time that we also rethink about how we think of GRC rather than as an application to more like a programmatic construct. So for example, think about 10, 15 years ago, I used to work a lot in data centers, right? If you ask me to, for example, say that why don't we provision a set of services, right? It takes a whole bunch of calls. It used to take a whole bunch of calls, right? You would have to work with the network engineer, the storage engineer, the compute engineer, so on and so forth, right? In order to be able to create even a single service or a server. And that changed with, for example, a lot of things around virtualization, VMware, KVM, so on and so forth. But that completely changed, right? In the world of cloud, where you, for example, the idea of a VM, of any service for that matter, is just an API call away, right? So the concept of what you call as a service today or a VM today is just an API call. That's what it has come down to. And the point is that it is time that we also think of GRC from that perspective. So we need a programmable construct of what we call as GRC, and I think we need to move towards it. But the idea here is that we need to be able to bring more stakeholders into this conversation within the organization and out of the organization. The second one, what I would call is, actually, it's a very difficult problem to solve, compliance, because I think there was also a question in the tool in terms of, are there tools that, for example, there are a lot of security companies, there are like 1,500 security vendors that come up, all full disclosure. We are a startup, and people like us actually try to sell security products through fear, right? That's what happens. And if you really look at the number of companies that are mushrooming in the security space, there are many companies that are coming about. But the problem very uniquely in security assurance and security compliance and security governance is that there are many paths to implementation, right? So for example, if you really think about a very simplistic example of saying, I want to restrict access control, right? And what does that mean? You double click, and that is ubiquitous to whether you do NIST CSF, whether you do any of these PCI DSS, you can take any framework, right? Access control is obviously front and center to it. And if you sort of break down this problem, then you say, okay, what does my implementation look like? Have I implemented this in the cloud? Have I implemented this in Kubernetes? In whatever format. Then the next question comes about, how do I implement access control, right? And that could mean, for example, I have a jump host infrastructure, right? Or a bastion infrastructure that I'm connecting to. Now, the next question comes about, okay, how do I restrict access to that, right? So you can very quickly, and there are many ways you can do this, right? For example, if I wanted to limit an SSH access, I can handle this at a firewall. And for example, if you are a shop that uses eBPF, right, and Cilium, and you have migrated that into some sort of that CNI stack, you can drop packets, in sort of IP tables or NF tables, or even you can do this in eBPF. And there are many different ways in which you can implement this. So for anybody to claim that you can click a button and can automate is actually a very difficult proposition in security assurance and compliance. So that's one of the challenges that we face as a community as well. So because there are many paths, right? How do we sort of get a hold of that context? And that has been a big challenge for us as well. So if we talk about automation and automation of these metrics, because metrics are nothing but the ability for us to be able to ascertain the configuration posture and collect the data and sort of report the data, right? And the question is, how do you go about trying to evaluate this, whether this makes sense for us in the context of risk and threat model that we have? I think that's a huge challenge that we'll have to overcome as a community. The third is that I think this is an area that is getting better. What I would call is the lack of engineering tools. we need to move into the area where the sort of idea of assurance as a policy, right, is a programmable construct. And the easiest example is that if you're in the Kubernetes space, I'm sure you're all familiar with OPA, right, the Open Policy Agent, and there are a few tools that have come about, but we don't have that, right, sort of in the broader context of what we want to do in the security assurance as a space. So I think we need, and I think this is an area that is getting better and better. There are a lot of companies that are coming around in the space, but we need to be able to move the idea of where policy governance, right, has to be distributed. Not only do you need to be able to bring in people who can write sort of very simplistic policies, even if they are not developers, but you also need to be able to build engineering as a discipline, right, within these organizations, which may be a tall call, right, for many companies, in order to be able to bring them, in order to be able to treat this policy as core, right? And there is a lot of work that is happening there. And finally, all of this doesn't make any sense, right, if we are not able to operate this at the speed of DevOps. Because we can do all of this, and if you're still going to evaluate this on once every quarter, worst once every year, right, none of this makes any sense. So we need to be able to bring this into a notion of how we can consume the idea of security assurance and the idea of security metrics, right, just as you would consume any other data, right? And we need to convert this from a systems problem to a data problem. And where you're able to simply sort of consume this, imagine where you build your own Jupyter notebook and all of us have the tools where we can become analysts, right? Where we are able to consume these metrics, and we are not only just reporting on the metrics, but we are able to create intelligent correlation across these different metrics, which I think is a somewhat long way to go, but I think we can certainly get there, right? So the way I see this problem in terms of realizing a continuous audit metrics in its true intent would be to be able to fundamentally shake about how we are able to, how we see some of these problems. And we don't have to go, try and sort of disrupt this whole thing. But the point is that we need to take actionable steps in small circles in each of these areas in order to get there. And we don't have to completely do this, on day one, but, how do we sort of acknowledge some of these endemic problems that exist, and how do we take steps in order to get there? It's something that we'll have to do as a community.
Well said. Cassandra, I want to do a check on time and see.
Okay. Yeah, so we're at 12:43. We'll end
Okay.
at 1. We do have several questions in the QA, a couple of duplicates. And the first is, will the slides be available after today's event? Mosi and Raj, if that's okay with you, we can make them available on the Cyversity site.
Sure. That's fine with us. We'll make sure we get that to you.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how do you automatically collect evidence for compliance using cloud native tools? This was asked earlier on during the discussion.
All right, Raj, I think that's
So I think there are, the good news is that there are, for example, if you take AWS, there are a whole bunch of tools that can certainly help you. For example, AWS has this concept of config, AWS config, where they have out of the box, they have written close to, I think, 200 rules as of talking right now. And I think that continues to sort of extend, right? And there are other products that layer on AWS config as well. So for example, you have AWS config, and then that integrates natively into AWS Security Hub, right? Where you're able to look at these metrics, or look at these sort of the measures, right? And you're able to consume that from AWS Security Hub. That also integrates into the AWS Audit Manager, right? So AWS, for example, has a bunch of native tools. There are some challenges that exist in terms of if you want to extend that and apply that into your context. But the good news is, out of the box, there are some tools. Same thing with Azure. So if you look at Azure, they have something called an Azure policy. They have done a good job. In fact, Azure policy has a lot more rules. And obviously, the Azure Defender for cloud, which used to be called Azure Security Center, has a lot of these rules that are baked in as well, very specific to Azure. And the good news with Azure is that they also do this with other third-party systems, right? And then there are these third-party products like Palo Alto Networks. Palo Alto Networks, for example, the Prisma Cloud has close to around 400 rules that they baked in, and you will find a lot of combinations. And there are some open source tools and there are commercial tools as well. Aquasec, for example, Cloud Deployed has some of these tools, and there are a bunch of these commercial tools that Cloud Custodian, for example, primarily play in the Kubernetes space, and there are a whole bunch of tools that are there in the open source as well. So the good news is that you actually have a lot of momentum in this particular space where you can pick cloud native tools to do some of this work. But the challenge is also that you have to be able to understand how this applies in your context. And the bigger challenge comes in is that most of them are very black boxes in nature. So if you really wanted to modify them, right, that's where I think you will find into one of these challenges, but you will find a whole bunch of security tools, and I can try somehow put a compendium and send it out, right? If you're interested, I can certainly do that.
And I guess, there's also the question from Dominique Singer earlier, asking about what GRC platforms do this, because Raj, you mentioned native tools from the cloud providers themselves. And I know, well, we published an article about this, but I think the point is the GRC platforms need to evolve to collect this information from those cloud native solutions. Like you mentioned AWS Audit Manager, which I guess it would be the closest thing AWS offers to a GRC tool.
Correct.
And you can, it does provide the ability to create a custom framework. So you could create a custom framework in AWS Audit Manager that is based off of the Cloud Controls Matrix or the Continuous Audit Metrics Catalog.
Correct.
And matter of fact, in our last week's working group meeting, we were actually discussing AWS Audit Manager and reaching out to AWS to get them to consider including the Continuous Audit Metrics Catalog as one of the framework templates that they offer, and so that you don't have to create it yourself from scratch. So if you want to participate more in those discussions, please join the working group for that. And Raj is too humble to admit to talk about it himself, so I'll say it. Raj also, the company he works for, develops a GRC platform that does what Dominique Singer is asking about. So there are solutions coming to market, but the traditional GRC platforms need to evolve to get there.
And did you share the name of the tool?
Oh, it's a Compliance Cow.
Thank you.
And there was one other question.
There are a couple of more, and then one specific to Raj, but go ahead, please.
Okay. I guess maybe it already got answered then. I thought there was another one tied to the tooling, but I think I just addressed that one. I saw one about a white paper. We'll provide a link to a white paper on this topic at the end of on the last slide. So when we provide the slides, you'll also have links to the white paper for more information. I think really quickly, because I saw some questions around this. Raj talked about some of the technical challenges. In terms of implementation challenges, there are some questions in here about resistance from traditional InfoSec teams, about DevSecOps and continuous audit, and and how do you approach it. There was one about adoption of risk-driven metrics being slow, because most companies haven't transitioned out of legacy post-mortem metrics. I think those are all implementation challenges for building continuous trust with continuous audit metrics. And I think a best way to approach that is it has to start with a business case, right? You have to give people a business reason why business as usual isn't going to work anymore. And so we kind of try to make a case for that in the earlier slide where we're talking about how cloud security assurance is too slow. But I think that's what we have to switch the mindset into thinking about what is the value of trust, all right, in a security program, and what is the mean time to trust, right? Like the question about postmortem, because we always talk about things like mean time to remediation, but what is the mean time to trust? How long does it take your organization to build trust with its stakeholder? So if it's a B2B organization and you have to provide responses to vendor security questionnaires from prospective customers, how long does it take to complete a questionnaire from start to finish? Or even more importantly, how long does it take for a customer to find your security measures satisfactory to the point where they're willing to do business with you, right? I've seen organizations where they can respond to a questionnaire in 1 business day, which typically happens at the end of quarter when the sales teams are under pressure to meet their quotas. to certain organizations where it could take a quarter to build trust with the customer in the security program. But making the business case for that, like, what is the value of that trust? Like, how valuable is it to be able to build trust with stakeholders faster? Like, if you can close deals faster, what does that do for your bottom line, right? What value does that provide to the organization? If you're a B2C customer, like Twitter just had a security breach they announced at the beginning of the month, right? How does that impact your user turnover? How does it affect your ability to monetize your product? I think you have to try to make a business case for continuous trust. And then the other thing is, I think we need to build some more subject matter expertise. So like Raj is talking about the technical challenges. I think on the GRC professional side, I think we need to become more educated in some of those cloud native tooling and just cloud native technology that we can leverage to provide that continuous trust at a faster rate and reduce that mean time to trust. And then the same thing goes for the engineering side, right? We need more people like Raj that have an engineering background, but understand the value of trust and become more educated on the GRC subject matter so that they can start building that into their work. Resource availability, we're all operating with trying to do more with less, right? Everybody has seen headlines about the shortages of people available or the openings, so many openings in cybersecurity and how there's a shortage of talent. And so we all have to confront that reality and start this is why we talked about bringing compliance where people are, where they work, so that we don't have to find perhaps a native cybersecurity talent or expert, but we can educate the person who in their daily job have some responsibility to build trust in their part of the organization and educate them on how to do that. And that'll help us increase our resources to try to confront this problem. And then the other thing is we have to, agility. Like there was the question earlier about, or the statement in the Q&A about SOC 2 requiring a minimum of 6 months of evidence for an attestation. And that is what most CPA firms will tell you. But when you push a CPA firm, they will tell you that they can provide attestation on 90 days, but they won't go less than that. And so we need to become more agile if SOC 2 at 90 to 6 months is not flexible enough, then we need to find another way of providing assurance and building trust with our stakeholders, whether that's working with the CSA and the STAR registry or finding some alternative mechanisms of doing that. But we have to start finding ways to do that and be more agile in our approach. I guess we'll probably skip this last question, Raj, and just go right into Q&A.
Correct.
We have some examples in the slides about what the metrics look like and how you can contribute if you're interested in joining the working group and providing your own input to these metrics. So that's included in the slide. I'll leave this up on the screen. Raj, what other questions would you like to address from the Q&A?
So one thing I would say is that I think if we are wondering how to get to the repo, the link there is there at the end of the slide to the Cloud Security Alliance Continuous Audit Metrics. The one thing I would point out is that if you are confused in terms of how to navigate through this particular repo, the easiest way to do it is go into the wiki page. So you will find when you click on GitHub, you will find wiki on top, right, where you will find code issues, pull requests, so on and so forth. And click on the wiki page. On the right, you will find for two documents in particular. One is called the metrics catalog in the YAML format and the content of a metric. And these are documents that are available on the CSA site as well. So if you search for them, you can get it. But the easiest way is to look at the wiki page. And it is a work in progress, and we continue to update it. But please take a look at it, right? And it may sort of very quickly walk you through how we have structured this particular metrics YAML, right? And what is there, and you can look at the HTML file as well. Maybe Mosi, it will be helpful if you can quickly walk through how to contribute to this, right? Or how do people participate in this as well?
Sure. So you can engage with us clicking the links that will be available in the slides for the working group. And we have the link to the GitHub. All of the work for the working group is managed through GitHub. And so if you're not familiar with GitHub, it's easy to create an account. You can sign in with an existing identity provider like Google. But once you click the link to get to the GitHub for the working group, you'll see across the top, you'll see issues and pull requests, and you can just simply click on one of those links and create your own issue with a question in it or with a metric that you want to consider. And then those submissions get discussed at each working group meeting. And once the working group discusses the metric, it will be finalized in a pull request, and the YAML file that you see on screen, which is simply just a text file and a markup language that's human and machine readable, will be published. And the metrics catalog gets updated in real time as an HTML file, so that whenever we publish the next white paper, it's easy for us to export it and share it with the community.
Right.
I'm sorry, I saw Dominique's question. The name of the working group is the Continuous Audit Metrics Working Group. And then the name of Raj's company is Compliance Cow that he represents, in addition to us both being CSA members.
I think Warren also had a question on the white paper that covers this discussion.
Yes.
Yes, so we have a link to that. It's the Continuous Audit Metrics Catalog towards a machine readable representation. That's the name of the white paper. And so we have a link to that in the slides.
And I think the link to the working group is also there in the last slide. So if you're interested, you should be able to join using the link. Mosi, do you want to also talk about how frequently we meet, sort of some basic logistics?
Good point. Yes, the working group meets every 2 weeks, twice a week. So on Wednesdays and Thursdays. The Wednesday meeting is at noon Eastern, and the Thursday meeting is at 10 a.m. Eastern.
Okay, thank you. So we're almost at the top of the hour, and thank you, Mosi and Ron, so much for that very informative presentation. I do recommend to the attendees today to become part of the working group. Definitely engaging and can learn a lot there as well. So thank you so much. And in advance, thank you for making the slides available to our members. Going to share my screen here. Do you mind unsharing, Mosi, for me?
Yes, I will.
Okay, and to our attendees, thank you so much for attending today's session. If you will, there's a link that was provided in the chat session. We ask that you complete that to provide feedback on today's discussion. And I'm going to share with you a little more information about Cyversity. Our great speakers for today. And the mission of Cyversity. We are an organization whose focus is on representation of women and underrepresented minorities in the cybersecurity space. Our programs are designed to diversify, educate, and empower. Our goal is to tackle the great cyber divide with scholarship opportunities, diverse workforce development, innovative outreach, as well as mentoring. You can find out more information on our website, which is cyversity.org. Find out about the great programs that we offer, how to connect and engage in the community as well. We do have a paid membership model, students $20, professionals $100 annually. So please check out the website. And as I recommended earlier, please email us at atlanta@cyversity.org. Lastly, we have an upcoming Engage webinar on Sunday, the 28th, a part of our Impact Interview series. And then this coming Saturday, come stop by Cyversity Atlanta chapter's booth at B-Sides Atlanta Conference. We are also doing a panel discussion at 4 p.m. on diversity in the cybersecurity workforce. So again, to Mosi and Raj, thank you again for joining us. To our attendees, thank you, and stay safe and stay connected. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.